Want to welcome Kai Harris, author of What the Fireflies Knew, which was one of the 2023 notable books. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I just wanted to say this one was a special one for me. I'm a Lansing resident, so it's not actually that often that we have titles that actually take place in Lansing with Detroit family. So it was worked for me in a lot of ways.
Nice.
In the sense of kind of thinking back to that same sort of time period, that
Yeah.
worked so well for me.
Yeah, good. That's what's up.
So starting with the conversation, can you give us a background on yourself and kind of how you became a writer?
Yeah, so I'm from Detroit, just like KB. I grew up in Detroit with my mom and my sister and my grandmother and my dad. And I didn't, I was always a reader. I was always a kid who loved to read more than just about anything else that I could be doing in the world. I remember my sister would be like, begging me to go outside and play or to do other things. And I'd be like, no, I have to stay in and read this book because, today is the day where we're going to find out this, important piece of information. Mm-hmm. And she's like, whatever day you read it is the day when that happens. And I'm like, no, today's the day, So I've always loved to read. I didn't really think about myself as a writer when I was growing up. I liked to write poetry, which was mainly just for fun. I had started trying to play with the idea of writing because I saw one of my classmates writing, working on a story. And I was like, oh, how cool. I love to read. I could probably write a story. And I tried to do it. And it was the hardest thing I had ever tried to do. And so then I was like, well, I'm not a writer. And so I had just pretty much moved along. But then I figured, that really what felt hard was writing fiction. And so I started playing around with other kinds of writing. So like I said, I already loved poetry, just like writing that for fun. But I was going to church a lot and I started getting interested in writing church plays. So I was also an actor. And so that felt like pretty natural to me. So I was working on that for a little bit. And then, I started thinking about screenwriting, writing for, film and TV. But meanwhile, I went to college to not do any of that. I went to college and I was focused on pre-law and, I wanted to be a lawyer just because, I don't know, I didn't have any really great reasons, but that was what I was planning to do with my life. And it was when I was in college that I kind of started down the writing path, which just happened because I didn't officially declare a major because at some point I got off the pre-law thing. So I hadn't officially declared a major. And, it's senior year of college and I go to my advisor and I'm like, well, what can I do now to hopefully still graduate? And my advisor let me know, like, well, you've taken a ton of English classes. And I was like, cool, which I took those classes just because I still loved reading. And so that's kind of how I became an English major. And then I went back to school a couple more times to get my master's and then my PhD. And during those times, I became more focused on writing. And fiction was actually the last type of writing that I got into. And it ended up being the one that stuck.
That's cool. It's interesting that the roundabout ways that we get to these things.
Yep.
So what's your writing process like?
So my writing process is very different depending on what I'm writing and I don't know, and all the other factors of my life. When I wrote Fireflies, I don't think that I'll have that writing process with probably anything else that I write because that book was, it was in my mind for so long that I think when I sat down to write it, I already kind of knew what I was going to say because I had just been thinking about it for a while. And I think that's a privilege that we get when we're writing our first thing is that a lot of us think for a while about like, oh, there's this story I want to write. And so in a lot of ways, we're already writing it in our heads. So that's how it was for me with Fireflies. So when I sat down to write it, believe it or not, I wrote the whole first draft in less than a month. And so I did do some things on the front end that made that possible. I created an outline. I had like a visual, like a board that I created for myself with like the scenes that I, could envision in my head that I knew I wanted to include. So really it was just fleshing all of those things out one by one. I could see all of it and I just had to write it down in a document. Mind you, I then, spent several years revising after that quick first draft. I was revising for, I don't know, probably 3 years on my own before getting an agent in that whole process. So that was what it looked like with that book. I just actually finished writing my second novel, and the process looked entirely different. I go back and forth on whether or not I outline before writing or after. So with this novel, I didn't create an outline until after I had written the first draft. And then what the outline does is it kind of helps me to see what I have and what I need to have. So like where there are gaps or where, there are issues with the chronology. This would be better if it happened before this thing or after. I'll, sometimes play around with like story beats and see, I like to use the Save the Cat story beat structure, which Save the Cat is actually written originally for screenplays. And so I learned about Save the Cat when I was learning how to write for film and TV. But then there's a newer version of it that Save the Cat writes a novel, which again walks you through like the different beats of a story. So I'll, incorporate things like that to see where things are landing, if things are making sense. So, but I don't know. I try not to plan too many things in advance when I'm writing. I try to be very regular with my writing practice. If I'm not writing every day, I'm writing as often as possible. There's usually not a week that goes by where I'm not writing. And then with each session, I'm just kind of trying to feel it out. Like, what do I feel like I have energy to work on today? Maybe I don't have the energy, the stamina, the creativity in this moment to write a brand new scene, but maybe I can go back and fix some random, little things, or maybe I wrote some notes to myself, like flesh this out with an example of blank, or research this thing, or, so every day I can find something that I can do to put energy towards my writing based on what I feel like I, have in the tank. So
that's really cool. And it's interesting to think about the outline afterwards too. That's just an interesting, different thought process I hadn't applied to it before. So how did you get the idea for Fireflies? So, I don't know that I had like the full idea until I was writing it. So there were certain things that I did know. I knew that I wanted to write a story about, based on a memory. And so I guess going backwards a bit, when I was in my master's program in Nashville, I was in a class where my professor had us write a short story based on a prompt. And the prompt asked us to remember a moment from our lives and to try to put that moment down on the page in a way that would, make it come alive for the reader, that the reader would feel like they were there and, they can see it and they can visualize it. So I wrote about a memory from my childhood when I would spend summers in Lansing with my grandfather. And the memory was about catching bugs mostly. I don't know why, that was like my favorite thing I did when I was there. We had fireflies, which I did not call fireflies, I called lightning bugs. Mm-hmm. But we love to catch lightning bugs. We love to catch caterpillars, roly-polies. Like I was very big into bugs. I don't love bugs anymore. Spoiler alert. But so I was remembering all of those little kind of just peaceful moments. And the summers that I would spend with my granddaddy were like very different, like pacing and everything, because I grew up in Detroit in a very like busy neighborhood. For most of, for a lot of the time we lived on the side of a service drive, like a freeway service drive. Okay. So it's like a heavy traffic road right outside my house. So it's always loud. It's always a lot of traffic, people, noises, cars, just everything. And so Lansing always felt to me just like an escape. It was like, I'd read books like The Secret Garden and, things like that and Narnia. And I'm thinking to myself, like, Lansing gave me that feeling of like,
going somewhere completely different. And where my granddaddy lived, there weren't a lot of other people around, so it was very quiet. And it was just like, we're just catching bugs and hanging out outside all day, you know? So I wrote about that because it was just like, just such a light and easy and precious memory for me. And when I went back and saw what I had written, I was like, this is really cool. I had other people giving me feedback on it, and they were just like, wow, like, I love the way that you wrote this. You know, I really felt like I was there. And so then I decided, like, okay, well, how can I make a story out of this? And so I started envisioning a character who could be in that setting. I wanted to think about what could be happening in her life that would make this setting even more meaningful, right? So for me, I went to Lansing all the time, but for KB, I had this be her first summer there. I had her grandfather be a stranger to her, right? She's coming off of the loss of her father. So I created all of these plot points that made that setting even more meaningful, if that makes sense. So it started from me remembering something that was precious to me, and then creating a character and giving her a story that would make that setting even more precious to my readers.
Okay. So one of our questions is, how would you define this work? But kind of the twist to yours is that there's always that line of, is this for adults or is this for teens, that keeps coming up with.
Yeah. So, you know, I think the main definition that I feel comfortable with is just that it's a coming of age story. Mm-hmm. I think what's interesting is we get so concerned with like thinking about like who it's for. And I've had that question so often, and I'm like, well, I guess it's for whoever wants to read it and feels like it makes sense to them, but it can definitely be read by adults, and it can be read by young adults as well. But, you know, I think when I was thinking about who would read it, I was imagining that you could read it at either of those stages of life and it would impact you differently. Like, I've had young readers who told me about their experiences with reading the book, and they were very meaningful experiences. Either, you know, they were able to relate to the characters, you know, kind of figuring out her identity, or, you know, figuring out sibling dynamics, sibling growing up, you know, shifting dynamics, loss of a parent, right? You know, so I've had young people tell me that those kinds of things, you know, really stood out for them. It's interesting because I'm a professor at Santa Clara University, and last year, there was a class where my book was an option for students to read. And some of the students read my book and they did presentations on them. And they met with me to tell me the kinds of essays they wrote based on the novel. And it was like blowing my mind, because they were writing about some topics that I hadn't even noticed that I was like really putting in there, or, you know, not in like very specific ways. And then they're saying to me, you know, I'm, you know, read your novel, and now I'm doing this presentation about, you know, young people's, you know, having voice, and the, you know, potential barriers to voice for young people, and how that factors into like current things that young people are dealing with. And it was just really astounding to me, like, oh, cool, you know, this could be meaningful in all these different ways. I have had people who are my age say to me, this is so meaningful to me because I was that age in that time frame, right? The book is set in 95 and KB is 10, which is a decision I made simply because I was 10 in 95, right? So for people who read the book who are my age, then they also have that experience of like, I remember being this age at this in the 90s, right? And what those experiences were like. And then I have readers who are, you know, older than me and who say, oh my gosh, I see this, I felt so, you know, I've had people say to me, you know, this is my identity. It's almost opposite KB's identity, but I still really related with this aspect of her personality or her identity or her experience. So, you know, I would define this book as really just like, it's a coming of age story that I think is very universal. Lots of people are able to resonate, to understand, to feel, to relate to KB or to, you know, various characters in different ways. And, you know, the most meaningful definition to me about the book is that it's a Black girlhood story. And I really wanted to write about Black girlhood, you know, in a way that felt very simplistic almost, just really focusing in on all of the parts of that experience, not just trauma, not just joy, but just also ordinary moments, learning to cook, being bored, trying to meet your cousins, get along with your sister, get your hair done, whatever those, situations are. And in writing a story on Black girlhood, I came to discover again how universal it really is, and how many people are coming to me and saying, I know you wrote a Black girlhood story and I'm not a Black girl, but I really, really felt everything that you wrote.
Mhm. I'd have to agree. I'm in your older set and really felt like I remember that.
Good. Thank you.
So do you have favorite characters or pieces in the book?
So, it's always so easy to say that, I love KB.
Right.
I love KB so dearly, to the point where, one, I don't know that I'll ever write another character like KB, which is kind of crippling. I'm like, I just finished my second novel I was mentioning, and I really like my main character in my second novel, but I'm just like, something about
She's not KB.
I don't know. Maybe she's going to have her own thing down the line. But KB was just so special to me because the way that I got to know her, and it was my first time writing a novel, so I had never done that before, had that experience with a character. And so it was just so meaningful. And it was like, it got to the point where it'd be hard for me to write difficult passages because I didn't want anything bad to happen to her. I just loved her so much. So KB is very near and dear to me. I also really love Nia's character. I've had people ask me before if I think that I would write another Fireflies book. And at first, for many years, or not many years, the book came out like, it feels like this book has been out for 10 years, though, by the way.
We're working on it, yeah.
But for a long time, I was just always like, I don't envision that I would ever write another story about these characters. I had a reader ask me during a book talk if I would consider writing a book from Nia's perspective. And when I was asked that question, it was the first time that I could imagine that I maybe would write another Fireflies book. I still am not completely sold on it, but I love Nia's character. And it's meaningful to me that we don't really get to see so much of her perspective because the book's told through KB's eyes, and KB and Nia are a bit estranged during the course of the book. So we're not getting a lot of Nia. So I could imagine wanting to kind of, and in my writing process, I did sometimes write things from Nia's perspective that didn't end up going into the book, but just to help me understand her. So I also love Nia's character and just the two of them together. I love the sister dynamic. I have an older sister, and I didn't base their relationship on our relationship. Our relationship's a lot different than theirs because we are very close in age. We are 20 months apart exactly. And my mom referred to us as her 20-month twins. So she raised us like twins. So we did everything together at the same time. We were dressed alike all the time. So I didn't really have that experience with my sister of us growing apart in that way. But I think there's something so special about sibling dynamics. And so I love, the relationship between Nia and KB. So that's probably my favorite characters and, moments in the book. I love the scene where KB's catching fireflies. That's probably my favorite scene in the book. It's actually the first scene I ever wrote back when I was in grad school, and I wrote that scene from my memory. That was the scene that I wrote. It's very different as it exists in the book because, now I have a plot and I have characters and I can add in all these layers, but I really love the way that scene came together, both visually to me, on the page. I feel like even when I read it out loud, when I'm at, book events, I feel like I can see it happening around me. It's one of my favorite moments in the book.
So what did you think, or how did you feel when you heard about the Michigan Notable Award?
Oh my gosh. So I was very excited. I think one of the things that made me super nervous is that I wrote this book. It's a Michigan book. And then I left Michigan. I actually moved away from Michigan before the book came out. Mm-hmm. So we moved to California in 2021. And then the book was coming out in January
22. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I'm like, when does this book come out? And so it was really hard to move at that time. I felt like I was moving away from everybody that was going to support the book, everyone that was meaningful to the book. Like my family's still in Michigan. It was really difficult to leave. So I think when I found out about the Michigan Notable Award, the main thing I was feeling was, oh my gosh, yes, they remembered me. Like they saw me, even though I'm out here in California now, and they remembered that this is a Michigan book and I'm a Michigan girl. So that was super exciting. I loved the experience of, I got to come and do a tour. So because I'm in California, we kind of put everything together. So I was there, for the award, but also leading up to that week, I got to do 3 different stops, which was awesome. It's just, it's so much more meaningful to me when I talk to Michigan audiences about this book. It's everyone has their experiences with it and the things that resonate and whatnot, but there's nothing like talking to other Michiganders about this book and them being like, oh, this makes sense. One time I did an event in Lansing and people were asking me like, so what swimming pool was this? So what library were you referencing? Like all these very specific questions. And I was like, I don't know, because the thing is, when I was writing it, I was just trying to remember it as I did as a kid.
Right.
And so I was describing things as they live in my memory. And I didn't want to get too researched because then I felt like it would feel false. It would deviate too much from just that, I don't know, that sense we get in childhood when we like remember the neighborhood swimming pool, but there are only like these certain distinct things we remember about it, So it was just really special to be chosen. It was really special to be able to come back to Michigan to talk about the book with Michiganders, and to just, I'm looking at my award right now. It's on the bookshelf right in front of me every day. It's just a huge sense of accomplishment.
I think we touched on this, but why do you think people should read your book?
Well, because it's great now.
Yeah, I mean, I can very comfortably tell people I think it's great.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You know what? I feel like, yeah, a lot of what I was saying earlier, I feel like it's very universal. And, I think people learn things by reading it, which was actually not something I was intending. I wasn't thinking about, oh, I'm writing this book and people will learn something from it about themselves or about the world. I wasn't really thinking that way, but that has happened a lot. I've actually been very surprised by how many teachers and schools are reaching out to me to tell me my students are going to read this book. There's a high school here in California who I went and talked to last year. They all read the book and we did a big talk. Actually, I'm about to try to ridiculously show you this huge thing that they made for me because I love it so much. But the students at this school created this for me. If you can see, there's some beautiful art on the back of
yes.
And then all of these students signed.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And it's just so meaningful. It's so meaningful, them reaching out to me in that way. The teacher explaining to me what lessons she was able to teach in her classroom from this book. Those things are always very mind-blowing to me. So, what I will say is I definitely recognize it as a book that opens the door to difficult conversations. So I've had people say to me, oh, I want my younger child to read this, right? Like maybe they're in middle school or, I have a 10-year-old and people have asked me, has your 10-year-old read the book? And that's, a thing that I'm always saying, like, I think it's a really great learning opportunity, right? Maybe to buddy read it with your younger reader, because then it gives you the opportunity to talk to them about difficult topics, to talk about loss of loved ones, to talk about drugs and alcohol, to talk about touch and how we should be touched and how we shouldn't be touched, and race and racism in this country, and all of these topics that are important to talk about, whether you're younger or older or in between or whatever. These are all things that are important to talk about. And I think the book provides an access point for those conversations.
Very much. We're coming down to the end here. But we are librarians, a lot of us on this committee, and I am too. Which writers or works have you found yourself reading recently?
Yeah. So, okay. So I go through phases when it comes to reading, right? I'm just like, I'll get in a mood for something and then that's like it. That's all I want to be reading. And so I will say this, when I was teaching in my last quarter of teaching, I taught a class on Black girlhood. And so I was reading we read Toni Morrison, we read a bunch of different short stories by Black women writers. We were talking about Jesmyn Ward in that class, so I was reading a lot of the people who are like the biggest inspirations, I would say, to me as a writer. And so then when I got off of that, when I got done with that quarter, I was like, all right, I'm not reading anything like that anymore. And so what I've been reading this summer is a lot of love stories, which is really interesting because, well, I love love stories in general, like all of them. I don't really write love stories, or at least I have not yet. So we'll see what happens. Actually, my second novel does have a love story. But I've been really into reading love stories. So I had read 7 Days in June by Tia Williams, and I read that one first. And then I was like, oh, I love it. It's so great. And then everyone had been talking about Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan. So I read that recently, which was really cool because it's also like a dual point of view love story, which is something I'm really interested in. And then I just started reading Love Radio by Ebony Liddell, which is also a Michigan Notable Book Selection. And I got to meet Ebony when I was in Michigan, which was super exciting. So yeah, I've been reading a lot of love stories, keeping it light. I think that's also helpful for me when I'm writing things that are opposite of that. It keeps me balanced.
Makes total sense. Yep. That's the end of our questions. I want to thank you so much for doing this. And again, I loved your book, and I'm really thrilled that it was on the list.
Thank you so much. And this was wonderful. I'm very happy to be here. This, like I said, was just such an honor for me, being selected, being able to connect with readers. So just thank you all so much for the opportunity.